In a world driven by political maneuvering, corporate ambition, and social competition, the teachings of Niccolò Machiavelli, a Renaissance diplomat who wrote his most famous work over 500 years ago, remain startlingly relevant. When Machiavelli penned The Prince in 1513, he wasn't merely writing a handbook for Lorenzo de' Medici. He was documenting timeless principles of power that transcend centuries. "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are," wrote Machiavelli. This observation cuts to the heart of modern existence, the gap between perception and reality. In our social media-saturated world, where carefully curated images shape public opinion, Machiavelli would surely recognize the strategic manipulation of appearances that now occurs on a global scale. But what would this controversial philosopher make of our current landscape? How would his ruthless pragmatism apply to a world of instant communication, global corporations, and complex international relations? Would his advice, often criticized as amoral, find new justification in our increasingly competitive environment? The question that looms largest, is weakness truly a choice in today's world? And if so, what price do we pay for choosing it? Machiavelli's most revolutionary concept wasn't his advocacy for cruelty or deceit, but rather his redefinition of virtue. Unlike Christian moralists of his time, Machiavelli conceived of virtù not as moral goodness, but as decisive capability. The skill and willingness to take necessary action, regardless of conventional moral limitations. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good, he cautions in The Prince. This sentiment raises uncomfortable questions about modern leadership. When we insist our leaders adhere to perfect moral standards while navigating imperfect systems, are we setting them up for ineffectiveness? Consider the fate of Lehman Brothers during the 2008 financial crisis. While competitors like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase made decisive moves to reduce exposure to subprime mortgages, actions criticized as callous at the time, Lehman maintained risky positions partially due to concerns about market perception. Their hesitation to make unpopular but necessary decisions ultimately led to the largest bankruptcy filing in U.S. history, affecting thousands of employees and the broader economy. They stood on the precipice of financial ruin, blindfolded by their own moral hesitations, while their competitors leapt to safety. But does this mean abandoning all ethical considerations? Not necessarily. Machiavelli wasn't advocating for wanton cruelty. He was recognizing that leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions that appear immoral in the short term, but serve a greater good. It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity, Machiavelli writes. The key phrase here is according to necessity, suggesting ethical flexibility rather than ethical abandonment. What does this mean for you? Perhaps it means recognizing when your own moral absolutes become obstacles to effective action. When has your dedication to being nice prevented you from making necessary but difficult decisions? When has your commitment to absolute honesty damaged relationships that might have benefited from diplomatic silence? It is far better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, wrote Machiavelli in perhaps his most quoted passage. This statement contradicts much of modern leadership advice, which emphasizes emotional intelligence, empathy, and connection. But was Machiavelli right? In today's workplace, research consistently shows that likable employees receive more opportunities, better evaluations, and faster promotions. Yet there's a dark side to this emphasis on likability, particularly for those who prioritize being liked above all else. According to a recent workplace survey, 67% of employees who self-identified as people-pleasers reported experiencing burnout, compared to 38% of those who described themselves as assertive. Those who constantly seek approval often find themselves manipulated, overworked, and undervalued. the employee who never says no, who always takes on additional responsibilities without compensation, who avoids necessary conflicts. This person isn't practicing virtue, but weakness, a weakness that Machiavelli would view as self-destructive. Men are so simple of mind, and so much dominated by their immediate needs, that a deceitful man will always find plenty who are ready to be deceived, Machiavelli observes. In today's context, those desperate to be liked often find themselves surrounded by people eager to take advantage of this desperation. Their need for approval becomes a collar around their neck, with the leash held by anyone willing to offer conditional acceptance. But isn't kindness a virtue? Wouldn't a world of Machiavellian operators be cold and cruel? This misunderstands Machiavelli's point. He doesn't suggest eliminating kindness, but rather deploying it strategically. Kindness shown from a position of strength is generous. Kindness shown from weakness is merely exploitation. Ask yourself, when have you said yes when you should have said no? When have you avoided necessary conflict only to face greater conflict later? When has your desire to be liked prevented you from earning respect? Men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, for everyone can see, but few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few really know what you are, Machiavelli wrote. This insight predates social media by 5 centuries, yet perfectly describes our current reality. Today's leaders must manage their reputations across multiple platforms, understanding that perception often matters more than reality. The CEO who posts about corporate social responsibility while cutting employee benefits, the influencer who preaches authenticity while carefully editing their life, the politician who champions transparency while concealing information, all are practicing modern Machiavellianism. Consider Apple's reputation for environmental responsibility. When Greenpeace criticized Apple's environmental practices in 2006, the company initially responded defensively. However, recognizing the potential damage to their brand, Apple undertook a strategic reputation overhaul. By 2014, even Greenpeace was praising Apple as an environmental leader. Apple treated their reputation like a garden requiring careful cultivation, pruning negative perceptions and nurturing positive ones, while the underlying corporate ecosystem remained largely unchanged. Is this mere hypocrisy? Machiavelli would see it differently. He would recognize that reputation management isn't optional, but essential. In a world where information travels instantly and first impressions form permanent judgments, controlling your image isn't manipulative, it's necessary self-preservation. This gap between perception and reality isn't new, but the tools for managing it have evolved dramatically. Today's prince must master not just the battlefield, but the browser, not just the court, but the comments section. Your reputation stands like a castle wall between your true self and public judgment, not to deceive, but to protect what matters. But does this mean abandoning authenticity entirely? No. And here, Machiavelli offers surprising nuance. While he advocates controlling appearances, he also warns against pretense that cannot be maintained. The leader who presents a false image eventually finds that image impossible to sustain, particularly under pressure. What does this mean for your personal reputation management? Perhaps it suggests being strategic rather than deceptive. Understanding what aspects of yourself to emphasize in different contexts isn't dishonesty, it's social intelligence. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him, Machiavelli observed. This insight speaks directly to modern networking, the understanding that your connections often determine your opportunities. In today's interconnected world, alliances matter more than ever. Corporate partnerships, political coalitions, and even personal relationships function as strategic assets. Machiavelli would recognize that modern power rarely operates in isolation. It functions through networks of influence. Consider how Reed Hastings transformed Netflix from a DVD by mail service to a streaming giant by forging strategic alliances. Initially established studios saw Netflix as a minor distribution channel and willingly licensed their content. By the time they recognized Netflix as a competitive threat, Netflix had built sufficient subscriber base and technical infrastructure to begin producing original content. Netflix moved like water among the rocks of established media, flowing around obstacles, gradually reshaping the landscape through persistent pressure rather than direct confrontation. It is better to be impetuous than cautious, for fortune is a woman, and if one wishes to keep her down, it is necessary to beat her and knock her down, wrote Machiavelli in one of his more controversial passages. Setting aside the obvious sexism of his era, the core insight remains valuable. Bold action often succeeds where careful hesitation fails. But what about enemies? Here, Machiavelli offers perhaps his most counterintuitive advice: never do an enemy a small injury. This challenges our instinct to minimize conflict. Machiavelli suggests that if you must move against someone, do so decisively, leaving them no ability to retaliate. When Netflix faced a growing user revolt over a planned price increase in 2011, CEO Reed Hastings attempted to placate customers with half measures and explanations, rather than either reversing course entirely or standing firmly behind the decision. This small injury approach resulted in the loss of 800,000 subscribers and a 77% stock price drop. In today's professional environment, this might translate to making clean breaks rather than prolonged conflicts. The manager who terminates an underperforming employee quickly and completely rather than through a series of half measures might actually be showing a form of mercy, preventing extended suffering for all involved. Ask yourself, have you been bold or timid in building alliances? Have you prolonged conflicts that should have been resolved decisively? Have you surrounded yourself with people who enhance your capabilities or merely echo your existing views? Fortune is the arbiter of half the things we do, leaving the other half to be controlled by ourselves, wrote Machiavelli, acknowledging both the role of chance and the power of human agency. This balance between accepting circumstances and asserting control resonates powerfully in today's uncertain world. Machiavelli would recognize today's emphasis on resilience and adaptability as modern expressions of his concept of virtue, the capability to respond effectively to changing circumstances. The entrepreneur who pivots during market shifts, the leader who adapts to unexpected crises, the individual who reinvents themselves after personal setbacks, all demonstrate Machiavellian virtue. Consider how Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella transformed the company's fortunes after taking over in 2014. Inheriting a stagnant tech giant overly dependent on Windows and facing existential threats from mobile computing, Nadella made the controversial decision to embrace cloud computing and cross-platform services rather than defending Windows' dominance. Like a skilled sailor adjusting to changing winds, Nadella didn't fight the technological currents but redirected Microsoft's course to harness their power. I conclude that since fortune changes and men remain obstinate in their ways, men prosper so long as fortune and policy are in accord, and when there is a clash, they fail, he observes. This insight challenges both fatalism and arrogance, the belief that we are either entirely at mercy of circumstances or completely in control of our destinies. Consider how modern success stories often combine preparation with opportunity. The overnight success who actually spent years developing skills, the lucky break that came after persistent networking, the fortunate timing that resulted from careful market analysis, all these reflect Machiavelli's understanding that fortune favors the prepared. But what about genuine misfortune? Here, Machiavelli offers harsh but practical wisdom. When the event cannot be avoided, one should welcome it. This stoicism suggests focusing energy not on lamenting bad luck, but on responding to it effectively. Ask yourself, when have you blamed circumstances for failures that resulted from your own rigidity? When have you failed to prepare for foreseeable challenges? When have you missed opportunities because you weren't positioned to seize them? A prince should therefore have no other aim or thought, nor take up any other thing for his study, but war and its organization and discipline, wrote Machiavelli. While literally advocating military preparedness, the broader principle remains relevant. Leaders must master the core challenges of their environment. For today's leaders, these challenges rarely involve literal warfare, though military metaphors pervade business language. Instead, they involve navigating organizational complexity, technological disruption, and human psychology. The modern prince must understand not just strategy but systems, not just power but people. When Alan Mulally became CEO of Ford in 2006, the company was losing billions and headed toward bankruptcy. Rather than using traditional cost-cutting as his primary approach, Mulally instituted a radical transparency system where executives publicly reported problems in weekly meetings using color-coded charts. When he applauded the first executive to show a problem metric rather than punishing him, the culture rapidly changed to one of honest problem identification and solving. Mulally recognized that fear functions like quicksand in organizations. The harder people struggle to avoid it, the deeper they sink into dysfunctional behaviors. Machiavelli would recognize that today's effective leaders combine technical competence with psychological insight. They understand both the metrics that drive performance and the motivations that drive behavior. They recognize that leadership requires both analytical skill and emotional intelligence. Men are driven by two principal impulses, either by love or by fear, Machiavelli observed. This psychological insight informs modern leadership theories about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The leader who understands when to inspire and when to establish consequences practices Machiavellian wisdom. But would Machiavelli approve of today's emphasis on collaborative leadership? Perhaps not entirely. While he would recognize the value of building consensus, he would caution against diffusing responsibility too broadly. A prince who is not wise himself cannot be wisely advised, he warns, suggesting that ultimate responsibility remains with the leader. Consider how modern organizations struggle with decision-making. Committees, work groups, and collaborative processes often produce compromise rather than clarity. Machiavelli would likely advocate for clearer lines of authority, not to enable tyranny but to enable action. Ask yourself, have you hidden behind consensus when decisive leadership was needed? Have you prioritized harmony over effectiveness? Have you mastered the core challenges of your environment or merely delegated understanding to others? The ends justify the means is often attributed to Machiavelli, though he never wrote those exact words. His actual position was more nuanced. He recognized that leaders sometimes must act in ways that conventional morality condemns, but he didn't advocate for unlimited amorality. In today's world, ethical complexity has only increased. Leaders navigate competing value systems, balancing shareholder expectations against environmental concerns, efficiency against equity, innovation against stability. Machiavelli would recognize that moral purity is rarely possible in such environments. Consider Elon Musk's approach at Tesla. To advance electric vehicle adoption, arguably an environmental good, Musk has employed questionable tactics, including overpromising on timelines, battling safety regulators, and creating demanding workplace conditions. These Machiavellian trade-offs helped Tesla achieve what many thought impossible, forcing the entire auto industry to embrace electric vehicles. Musk stands like a tightrope walker, balancing between visionary achievement and ethical compromise, maintaining forward momentum through constant adjustment rather than perfect balance. It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity, Machiavelli wrote. This suggests ethical flexibility rather than ethical abandonment, understanding when principle must yield to pragmatism. Consider modern business ethics. The company that outsources manufacturing to reduce costs may improve shareholder value while harming local communities. The tech platform that maximizes engagement may increase revenue while damaging social cohesion. These trade-offs have no perfect solutions. They require judgment, not moral absolutism. But does this mean abandoning all ethical constraints? Machiavelli would say no. He understood that completely amoral leadership ultimately fails because it destroys the social trust necessary for functioning societies. The leader who betrays too often soon finds no one willing to be an ally. Men sooner forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony, Machiavelli observed, recognizing that certain violations, particularly those affecting material interests, create permanent enemies. The modern leader who ignores this wisdom may win short-term advantages while creating long-term opposition. Ask yourself, when have you hidden behind absolute principles to avoid difficult ethical judgments? When have you justified means that weren't truly necessary for the ends you sought? When have you failed to consider the long-term consequences of expedient decisions? 5 centuries after his death, Machiavelli continues to challenge our comfortable assumptions about power, leadership, and human nature. His insights remain relevant not because the world has grown more cynical, but because human dynamics remain fundamentally unchanged. The essence of Machiavellian wisdom isn't cruelty or deception, but clear-eyed realism. It's the recognition that the world as it is often differs from the world as we wish it to be, and that effective action requires acknowledging this gap. A recent study tracking career trajectories found that professionals who describe themselves as pragmatic earned significantly more over time than those who describe themselves as idealistic, with the gap widening over time. This suggests that Machiavellian realism may indeed confer material advantages in competitive environments. For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live, that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. He wrote, "This counsel against naive idealism speaks directly to our time of complex trade-offs and imperfect solutions." When Howard Schultz returned as CEO of Starbucks in 2008, he found the company losing market share and identity. Rather than clinging to outdated strategies, Schultz made the difficult decision to close 600 stores and temporarily shut all remaining locations for retraining. This willingness to take decisive action revitalized the company. What would Machiavelli advise for personal strategy today? Perhaps these principles: recognize reality without being limited by it, cultivate strategic flexibility, balance idealism with pragmatism, build power through competence rather than manipulation, manage your reputation strategically. The ultimate Machiavellian insight might be this: power is neither inherently corrupt nor inherently virtuous. It is a tool whose moral value depends entirely on how it is acquired and applied. Like a sword, it can defend or destroy, its purpose determined not by its existence, but by the hand that wields it. Where the willingness is great, the difficulties cannot be great, wrote Machiavelli, offering a final note of optimism. For all his reputation as a cynic, he ultimately believed in human capability, in our power to shape circumstances rather than merely respond to them. In a world that often rewards weakness with exploitation and strength with opportunity, Machiavelli stands as a brutal but necessary reminder. Your choice between power and powerlessness determines not just your personal fate, but your capacity to affect the world around you. The question isn't whether to seek strength, but how to wield it once obtained. If you found these insights valuable for your own journey toward effective action in a complex world, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring these timeless principles to others seeking to navigate today's challenging landscape with wisdom and clarity. Join our community of modern Machiavellians who understand that true strength lies not in domination, but in the capacity to shape a better future for ourselves and those who depend on us.